Good afternoon, everybody. When Sue gave me the call to ask me if I would speak today, I asked her one of the most profound questions I could think of at the time, which was, are you sure you're calling the right guy? And I'm here as one of the alumni. I graduated in the class of '07, and I just want to thank SMLR for the opportunity to address you today because I think it's quite an honor. And I also want to thank SMLR for the great education that you gave me. And in fact, to call it an education really doesn't do it justice, because for me it was more of a transformational experience. And let me tell you why. When I started my master's program here, I was a relatively new HR director at Johnson & Johnson, and I had two groups that I was responsible for. One was the government affairs team, and the other was the law department. And until that point in my career, I had done a pretty good job of learning the HR best practices that most of the other big companies I had worked for previously started to employ. And so at that point in my career, my approach to HR at Johnson & Johnson was an approach that is still commonly used today, which is the, hey, this worked for me at my old company, so this is going to work for me at my new company approach. I call that the best practices approach. And the good news is that worked really well with the government affairs team. They weren't used to getting a lot of HR support. They were relatively remote in most cases. So the tools that I came with, they were very happy with. The law department, and I got to tell you, lawyers are probably one of the tougher groups that I've ever supported. Can anybody resonate with that? Yeah? I got a lot of lawyers. Never mind, I didn't mean that. And they're tough because, you know, they make an argument for a living, right? And so coming to them with a set of best practices without some argument as to why that would bring value to them didn't go well. And so when I started my master's here, actually, I was struggling with being influential and being able to impact the law department. So the good news is about a third of the way through my master's program, the School of SMLR gave me the knowledge and the tools that I needed to be more impactful. You helped me make the transition from being a professional in HR that was well-versed on best practices to being an HR thought leader. And once I started to make that transition, I was able to talk to the law department about their strategy and then translate that strategy into a set of HR deliverables that were specific to them. And once they saw that it was specific to them, they could see the value that it brought to their organization. And next thing you know, I was able to exert more influence on the organization, and ultimately I became much more successful in supporting that client group. And so that story kind of brings me to the things that I want to share with you today, which is a list of things that I think SMLR and even those of you who aren't in academia, who are other professionals, can do for the new up-and-coming HR leaders that are going to be entering the new dynamic and uncertain workforce that we have today. But before I take you through my list of recommendations, I thought it might be good if I took you through a set of slides that will give you the strategic framework that I use in order to serve up HR, its value to the business, and how to make that real on a daily basis. And I think once I take you through that, then the list of recommendations that I have may make more sense to you. All right, so the first is to take a step back. I want to start with a strategic question, which is what drives business success? And this is an age-old question, and many of you know people have been debating the answer to this question for eons, and there are many schools of thought on it. So I'm going to share with you my school of thought based on my own experiences. And so to start with, there are a number of schools of thought that are up there. I'm not saying I agree with them all, but the ones that are listed are those that I thought had enough resonance with me and enough merit that I thought they were worthy of consideration. So at the top of the list is technology. And the short story there is the premise behind that argument is, look, if I come into the field of competition with better technology than you do, or the competition does, then most likely I'll prevail. The next one is the business strategy, and in short, if I have a better game plan than the competition, the odds of me prevailing are very high. The one after that is the workforce, and essentially what that's about is the team, right? If I've got a better team than you, then most likely I'm going to be more successful. And then the one after that is kind of an interesting one. It's about leadership. And the premise there is it's the leaders who really rally the team to the cause, who really set the direction, and when a strategy calls for it, because things have changed, It's the leaders who can then refocus the team into the new direction. And so the premise there is if I have a better leadership cadre than you do, then more than likely I can be more agile because I can get my team focused and refocused if necessary. And then the last one, strategy execution. What that's really about is, listen, if I can get my strategic imperatives and I can boil those down to a recipe, if you will, right? Something that, a list of steps that almost anybody can walk up, pick up this form and be able to execute the game plan to a certain degree of high fidelity, then, I'll be much more successful than just about everybody else. So based on my own experiences, what I have found is although there's merit to all these arguments, in and of themselves, I don't see them as being primary business drivers. In my experience, I found that it's actually two things that drive the business forward. When I was in the Marine Corps, we used to have a saying, which was, what good is a game plan if you can't execute it? And so that's when it dawned on me that to drive an organization forward, it's really two things. It's the quality of the organization's strategy and its ability to be able to execute that strategy. And so let's say for a second you're buying that. You're buying that, right? Yeah. All right, so let's say for a second you're buying that, or at least enough that you'll let me go to the next slide. What then the next question is, well, what does that really mean to human resources? And so I think, in short, what that means is where strategy meets execution, that space where they overlap, that's HR's opportunity to have the biggest impact on the business. And HR's opportunity to have the biggest impact on the business, isn't that really the definition of what strategic HR is all about? And so what I'm arguing is in that space where strategy meets execution, that's where strategic HR lies. And that's where we can have the biggest impact on the business. And so you say to yourself, okay, I get that, so what does strategic HR really entail? And so what I work with my business partners about is where strategy meets execution, the biggest impact we can have on the business is to ensure that the business has the talent that it needs to be able to execute the game plan. And not just any talent, right? We need talent with the right knowledge, skills, abilities, and the one that gets often forgotten about is the right behaviors. And because most of the organization doesn't report to us in human resources, it's a shared responsibility that we have with the line leaders. And so if you buy into that, right, because when you're running an organization or you're running a P&L, the human capital piece of that is just one small part of what you're responsible for. But when we're in HR, that's the biggest thing we're responsible for. So it's a shared responsibility, which is why we in HR, we get a vote on who gets hired, who gets promoted, et cetera, because it's a shared responsibility that we have with the leaders to ensure that we can field a team that can execute our game plan. So far, so good? Make sense? Okay, so when I often talk about this, I often get a little bit of pushback. And the pushback that I get is, well, Claude, if the people don't have the right KSABs, I call them, right? Knowledge, skills, abilities, and behaviors. If they don't have the right KSABs, then we probably wouldn't hire them. And if they worked here, we probably wouldn't keep them. And so when I hear that, I tell a relatively embarrassing story. Are we still streaming live? No, it's okay. I'll still tell you this story. It happened 10 years ago. I think I'm over it. So the short story is I was working at Citibank, and I was hired to design incentive compensation plans, right? And so the bank, basically, they had a balance sheet. So you want to have a healthy business is balanced. You want to have on one side a healthy amount of assets, on the other side a balance of liabilities, so the business is balanced. Well, they didn't have enough assets, right? They had more liabilities, so they hired me to put in a compensation plan that would, entice the workforce to sell more assets. And so, well, what is an asset? To me, an asset is money in your pocket. It's a simple definition, but it works, right? A liability is money you owe somebody. Does that sound fair for the most part? Well, at a bank, that answer is completely opposite. Because the money that you put into a checking account, so, right, to me, that was money in the bank. That's money they owe you. So they view that as a liability. When they give you a loan, a credit card, a car loan, a mortgage, that's money you owe them. So that's an asset, right? So I'm at my desk, and I'm paying people a lot of money to open checking accounts, of which we already have too much. So with every stroke of my pen, I was killing the bank. That was funny, right? Every stroke of my pen. I got to tell you, when I got called to the 49th floor to talk about it, I didn't think it was all that funny at the time. I was 6'2" at the time. But with every stroke of my pen, I was at my desk killing the bank's profitability because I didn't have the right knowledge for that business. Yeah, so my point in telling that story is employees come to the workforce with a certain degree of KSABs, yes. But it's our role in HR to make sure they have the KSABs needed for our business. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you buy that, then you say, well, doesn't that beg the next question, well, how do we do that? And my answer to that is client assessments. And just so we're all on the same page, what I mean by doing a client assessment is basically using a set of data to ascertain whether or not you have a workforce that can execute your game plan. And you say, okay, so if I want to do client assessments, why is that necessary? Well, sports teams and military organizations, I think they have the luxury that they can have a practice every week, or when I was in the Marine Corps, we always had mock exercises, and those exercises allowed us to assess our workforce. We could take a look at any given moment and determine, do we have the right people to execute the game plan? And the data we got from those exercises or those practice sessions, we could use to either switch personnel, change our training curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the business world, we don't have the luxury of conducting practices on a weekly basis. Can you imagine a bunch of HR people out there practicing HR on a weekly basis? What would that look like, right? So how do we assess our talent? We have to use a set of metrics to do it. And so that's what I mean by doing a client assessment. And so in order to ascertain whether we actually do have on board a team, a workforce that can execute our game plan, we need to do a set of client assessments. And so if you buy that, you say, okay, well, what do you assess for? Because you can assess for just about anything. Well, in my mind, there's three parts to a complete talent discussion. And the reason the pie that says individual assessments is a little bit separate from the rest of the pie is I'm arguing that most large organizations do some form of individual assessment. And by that I mean they take a look at an individual, whether they're a key talent, a high potential, et cetera, or whether they're in a key skill, and they determine whether that person, based on their performance and their potential, have any gaps. And if they have any gaps, we put together a development plan, thank you, to make sure we bridge those gaps. Does that sound familiar to everybody, right, that process? So I think a lot of organizations kind of do that. So we have at least 1/3 of the talent discussion. But I'm arguing that there's 2/3 of the talent discussion we just don't have. One part is what I call the health analysis. It's a term I made up, which is essentially, it's an analysis to see, do we have a workforce that's healthy that can execute the game plan? And the other is what I call an alignment discussion. And the short story there is, are our best people doing our most important work? So if XYZ business is our most important business unit, who's our best business unit manager? Is there a marriage? If not, what are we going to do? Are we happy with that, if anything? Okay. So what I'd like to do is talk to you next about, well, how do you go about assessing? Because what I have seen is two main ways to assess a client group. One I call the survey approach, and the other I call a data-based approach. And the survey approach is essentially looking to use a bunch of questions to kind of get a feel for the organization. Now, I just joined Amitech 3 weeks ago, so the survey approaches worked well for me. And so what I'm showing you is a sampled set of questions that I've been asking the leaders that have been there for a while. You know, do you think you have the right leaders in the role to help you support what you have, what you need to do to add value to the business? So that seems to be a deep question, and I got to tell you, when we get into those discussions, the things that I've learned have been great, but what I've found is I haven't learned anything that I can go back to my desk and still do something. It has just given me areas where I still need to dig a little bit deeper. And so the reason I'm not a big fan of the survey approach is I think it's got very limited uses. Because I've been in a job 3 weeks, asking these types of questions is okay. What if I'd been there 3 years? And I go to the line leader and I say, hey, do you think we got the right leaders in the organization? They're going to look at me and say, well, Claude, you're the HR guy. What do you think, right? Do you see how you could lose some credibility with this approach if you don't use it well? But hey, it does have its uses. I'm just arguing I don't think it's the best use. So what's next is an assessment approach that uses data. And there's basically two types of data. What I'm showing you here is a scorecard. Most people have heard of scorecards, right? Yes? I'm not a big fan of scorecards, and I'll tell you why. So in this analysis, it shows two analyses. It shows at the top kind of an attrition analysis, and then it shows a diversity analysis. It shows where you were in September. It shows where you are in December. Kind of best thing you're going to get from this is kind of trending and reporting, kind of where we are, right? And the reason I'm not a big fan of it is this type of data, in my experience, often creates more questions than it answers. Because you'll get the question, well, is China in there? Does it include part-timers? Does it include casuals? And next thing you know, the conversation has spiraled somewhere else, right? Because you're talking about the quality of the data versus the point that you were trying to make. And you can't use this data, again, to take it back to your desk and do something with it. So what I want to take you through now is my last set of slides, which is an analysis that I use with my business partners. And again, I call it the health analysis. And it's determined to see, do you have on board a workforce that's healthy enough that can execute your business strategy? And it actually has three parts to the analysis. So the first part is flight risk analysis. And so what we're trying to do here is ascertain whether or not the business has exposure due to flight risk, people who are looking to leave the company. And so what we're trying to do is be predictive. And when somebody asks me what's the difference between prediction and forecasting, what my answer is forecasting may tell you you're going to have a problem with flight risk. Prediction will tell you who will be a flight risk. Does that make it? You see what I'm saying there? And so, and what we're trying to do here is when you talk to, especially business partners, you know, comp people, they tend to be a little more, you know, at ease with data, but business partners, they tend to shy away from data. We're using what I call is everyday data. We're using, in this case, I'm using time and level, I'm using comp ratio, and I'm using performance ratings. In and of themselves, none of that data is sexy, right? But when you put it together, those three elements can become quite powerful and quite predictive. And so here's how this analysis worked. We have performance ratings at my previous company. And so what we did is we took a look at, for the past 3 years, who got the highest performance ratings and whose pay was below the market. Now, the employees there know whether their pay is below the market because they get a pay stub every year when they get their raise, and it tells them what their comp ratio is. Comp ratio, if you don't know what it is, essentially if your job pays $100,000 and you make $90,000, your comp ratio is 0.9. If your job pays $100 and you make $100, your comp ratio is 1. So if your comp ratio is 1 or above, you're at market or above. If it's a fraction, a decimal, you make less than the market. So the employees know whether they're below the market. And then the other thing you might want to say, well, if somebody's below the market, were they newly promoted? If they've only been in their job 1 or 2 years, it may make sense they're below the market. So what this analysis did was essentially put together a pivot table, tell me who got the highest performance ratings, who've been in their job more than 2 years, so they're not new, and they still make below the market. Well, if the company told you for more than 2 years that you're one of our best, but your pay is still below the market, is it hard to predict that you might be looking for another job? Is that fair? And so all we're trying to do here is get a list of names, and that doesn't mean we're going to do anything about it, but we're going to have a planful conversation about whether we should do something about it, as opposed to having these folks come down one day and give us their notice, and we say, but we loved you. So what we found was this approach was highly predictive. A lot of the folks that showed up on this sheet actually came down to quit, and we wound up having a scramble the first time we put it together to talk to them about why you don't want to leave the organization. Another part of the health analysis is knowledge transfer. And so you can have knowledge transfer issues for two main reasons. One, you've got exposure due to folks who are retirement eligible, and with the baby boom generation approaching retirement, that could be a wave of people who could walk out the door. If you don't have a plan to replace them or to back them up, you could have a knowledge transfer issue. The other issue could be if you have what I call single incumbents, or often referred to as single points of failure. Somebody, they're the only person that knows how to do that job. If they leave, we don't know what we're going to do. Well, in this analysis, we determined that knowledge transfer, we had the biggest risk due to retirement eligibility. So all we did here was use, so this business partner used age only. I want to take a look at anybody that's over 55, because that was the earliest you could take the pension, and let's just see whoever's on that list, do we have a plan to back them up if they were to retire? Other business partners combined it with service. I want to look at age plus more than 10 years of service, et cetera. So when I talked to this business partner about why would you not use a service component, her answer was, I've got a lot of military retirees in my business. So even though they may have only worked for us 3 or 4 years, they could still retire. And if I throw a 5-year service component, I might miss them and we could be exposed. So the pivot table showed the names, and all we did was have a conversation about, do we have, you know, a backup plan if this person were to leave the organization? Then we also took a look at, we had defined several jobs that were key, right? The head of engineering, the head of design engineering, the head of manufacturing, et cetera. And so the next part of the analysis listed folks from that list of key jobs who could be retirement eligible, and do we truly have a backup plan for them? And then you could take the data and group it, right? So we could look at engineering as a whole, quality as a whole, and say, what is the pervasiveness of retirement eligibility in that group? And are we ready for that? Or are there things that we should put in place now? Apprenticeships, internships, entry-level hires, job rotations, try to get ahead of it. And what we found when we put this analysis together is the part about being predictive is the organization didn't even know they had some of these problems until we brought it to them. And so what that did for us is it positioned us as the people experts in the business. It built our credibility, and it allowed us to be more proactive to try to get ahead of it as opposed to responding to it. And so the last slide I want to show you of this analysis is what we call the suitability analysis. So we have certain jobs that we thought were key to the organization. And the premise here is we just want to see, do we have people in key jobs who perhaps shouldn't be in those roles? And again, the data's not sexy. All we did was we took a look at who had the lowest performance rating over a period of time. I think it was 3 years in this case. We also had potential ratings. Was there a potential rating that we didn't think they were eligible to go beyond their current role? So you're one of our lowest performance people that are rated, and we don't think you can go beyond a current role, your name would make the list, and then we would just have a discussion. You know, do we think we ought to make a change here? In some cases, one of the names on the list was they were new to the role, so you want to give them time to transition into the role. But in some other cases, we needed to make some changes, and we made those changes in a proactive way, and we were able to do it in a respectful way because we were ahead of the curve. We were able to assign people in roles where they were more successful. So I take you through that framework of what strategic HR means to me and how we try to make it real on a daily basis, because I think it'll give you some insight as to why I have my list of recommendations here. Whether you agree with the framework that I share with you or not, what I think SMLR can do to help future leaders in HR be successful going forward is to give them a strategic framework in which HR operates. So what does strategic HR mean? I suspect that if I asked all of you what strategic HR is, we'd probably get a ton of different opinions. But what's interesting, if you ask a room of finance people that question, what is strategic finance? You don't get such wide variation. Same in quality. You get kind of a more narrow solution set. And so my point is, should there be an SMLR view of what is strategic HR, and should we then train the folks coming through our program what that is and what they can do to make that view real on a day-to-day basis? And you have some access to some of the great minds in the field, even if, you know, back in the day they did a constitutional convention, maybe you do an HR convention, and you come to some agreement on what is strategic HR, what is our view of it. And so, because what I'm finding is most HR practitioners are paired with a business leader that's got at least 10 years of business experience on them. If you don't come to the table with a point of view of how you're going to add value to the business, I think you're going to struggle right out of the gate. So giving folks these tools when they graduate and they enter the workforce, I think will only position them for higher levels of success. That's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you.